to Chautauqua in a time of COVID. I'm here with my hand sanitizer and my rat at Restless Artist Theater in Reno and not in Oklahoma for Chautauqua. And since I'm all alone, I can dispense with that. Welcome to COVID Theater, I guess it is. I'm so thrilled to be here. I wish we'd come to all the wonderful communities in Oklahoma, but we'll have to make this count. Until that time, we can meet again, hopefully, this summer in June. I'm Doug Mishler, in case you didn't know, and I will be doing, hopefully this summer, Gene Roddenberry. And they asked me to create a workshop out of Gene and his beliefs, and that's what I've sort of put together. Something different than what I would have been doing this summer. One of the things that fascinates me about Gene Roddenberry as a visionary was his vision of this new world, of this new society that Star Trek sort of was created around, a community without want, where everyone lived their own desires and motivated by self-perfection and not by greed or avarice. Anyway, what I wanted to do with this workshop, and it's very brief, is to cover the early years of Gene Roddenberry, especially his time with his parents, and then his time in World War II as a pilot, and then shortly after the war as a pilot, because they really did shape his character, what he was looking for. The main things being adventure, but also this sense of what a leader should be. Part of this workshop is to sort of reflect on how the Star Trek captains were created out of this experience of his in the war and with flight, his career as a pilot, sorry. It's very hard for me to speak without an audience, so here we go. Anyway, Gene Roddenberry grew up in a fairly rigid household. His father was a Southerner, was a policeman, and was very strict and very taciturn. He had chased Pancho Villa across Mexico with Pershing before the Great War, and yet never really told those stories to his son. He had been in the Great War and been gassed horribly, and he never really talked about that. Even when Gene was very successful, his father would just sort of grunt at him in accolades. So his father was not all that open and not all that giving, and it seemed to have driven Gene to really want another kind of life, a life beyond this, something more uplifting, more adventurous, more noble. And you'll see that in how he pursues adventure as a young man. He loves to read, constantly reading, trying to lose himself. When he's reading, he's completely out of contact with other people. His parents will talk to him, he will not hear him. He will not even know they are in the room. Famously, he crashed a car once because his mind had become engaged with something he was working on, and his mind was in that world and completely oblivious that he was driving a car on the freeways in Los Angeles and crashed and almost died in the crash. But his youth was like that. He also, of course, fell in love with serial movies in the 1930s and the adventure of it, Buck Rogers, cowboy movies, whatever, anything that was outside the norm of life. When he's 18, he decides, and we don't know exactly why, but I think it is because of that adventure and freedom of flight, he starts to take flying lessons. They don't have much money, but he scrapes whatever he can together in high school to start flying. And by age 19, he has his pilot's license, and he's even instrument rated. Took him quite a while to get there. What you see with Gene immediately, two great quotes from Gene. He talked about the first time he soloed, and he talked about the freedom. He says something, and I got to check my quote. In this vast expanse of sky, you have the freedom to fly in any direction, completely free to go any way you wish, to see any sight. Later on, he wrote about flying his first time he flew at night with the stars up, and he wrote, "The brightness of the stars overhead, the surrounding me was the most thrilling and amazing feeling I'd ever had." You get this idea that this limitless possibility, the limitless adventures he could have when he was free in this plane to go wherever he wishes. Well, his wish for adventure and his wish to fly came really to fruition. He went to junior college, Los Angeles City College, for a couple of years, and then of course World War II broke out. He had already applied to become a pilot, and they told him they didn't need him, but after Pearl Harbor, they did need him, and they very quickly call him, and 11 days after Pearl Harbor, he is in San Antonio already at flight school training. He wanted to fly fighters, but he was so large that they told him, "You can't fly a fighter, you'll have to be a bomber pilot," which after a little bit of coaxing, he reconciled to. And in August of 1942, he graduated flight school and was rated for multi-engine bombers. He was assigned to B-17s in the 394th Squadron of the 5th Bomber Group, which was based in the Pacific. So he will go to the Solomon Islands, and there has quite a few adventures that do shape him in his view of what Star Trek will be. He flies 89 missions in the Solomon Islands, which is an incredible amount of missions. Now, many of them were not what you would call very active combat. They were, because of the way the Japanese fighter planes were, there wasn't a lot of danger in that regard. However, lots of long flights over oceans and bad weather. He once flew into a cyclone. They survived it. When they landed, they realized that hundreds of rivets that held the wings on and pieces of the tail section had fallen out, were vibrated out by the cyclone. His first sort of near-death experience, which of course in almost a Star Trek captain fashion, you just sort of, oh, well, that was close. The sense of death being part of the adventure, part of the excitement to come that close. He did actually have a serious crash a few months later. He was taking off in a bomber. One of the engines failed, another one was weak, so they decided they would abort the takeoff. But the brakes didn't work. The brakes didn't slow the plane down at all. It slid off the end of the runway, crashed into a ditch. It hit with such impact, it killed 2 of the crew. And Gene was very concerned about this. It very much upset him. And it took him a while to get back, to overcome the fact that it was his fault. Even though he wasn't the command pilot, he was just a co-pilot in this particular flight. But there was something about this crash, and we'll get to it, the other crashes he goes through, which shapes what he thinks a captain should be. The Star Trek captain, or even a captain of an airplane. The idea of this a nobility, a courage, a coolness, a calculation, that they react with not with emotion, but with intellect. Anyway, he survives this crash. He continues to fly many more missions. And then in 1944, he's sent back to the United States. He's a captain now. And his job for the Army Air Corps is to travel around the country and investigate crashes. And while doing this, late in 1945, the plane crashes that he's in. To go to another crash, he crashes. In the crash, it's another terrible crash. 2 of the members are killed. He drags 2 other of the crewmen out and to safety, very heroically. Doesn't think about his own injuries, pulls these men to safety. And again, you get this idea of You don't leave anyone behind. You will pay anything to bring your crew members back. The selflessness of it, in a way. He decides that he's had enough of the military and he leaves. Now, he'd had other issues with the military, and I'll talk about them in a second, mainly with command. He joined Pan Am 5 days after leaving the military, and within 2 weeks has flown from New York. He was based in New York. He flew to Europe and then flew on to India. And he was supposed to come back to London to catch another flight. And so he was deadheading back in the middle of the night from Delhi to Cairo was the first junket. And he's just deadheading, so he's in the passenger seat, the jump seat in the cockpit, in one of the old Constellations, the 4-engine, triple-tail Pan Am Clippers, if you will. About a third of the way back, in the middle of the night, one of the engines quits. Now they have 3 more, which is okay, but as they're going on, they start to overheat. The other engines start to overheat, and then within about 30 minutes, one of them explodes into flame, which catches the wing on fire. They fire the extinguishers, nothing works, the flames are getting more and more. The pilots are pretty clear that they're going to have to land in the middle of the night, somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, and they have no idea really where they are, but that it'll probably be some endless desert. They start coming down in the pitch black. They send Gene back to prepare the crew, the 2 stewardesses at the time, the term, the 2 stewardesses and the passengers, there's about 20-some passengers, to prepare them for what they felt would be ultimately a crash landing in the dark. He's back there being Gene after he got everyone prepared. He sat down and he decided, you know, I'm not going to live through this, so I should probably pray. Then he realized that praying would be hypocritical because he didn't believe in God, not in an organized religion sense of the deity. That's another workshop. And so he figured it was too hypocritical to pray, so he just sat there, counting, he said, counting and waiting. The crash was horrific. It tore the plane into multiple pieces. Everything caught on fire. Everybody was injured. Gene and 7 others had walking wounds. Gene broke several ribs, tore part of his shoulder cartilage and that. So he was in a great deal of pain, but he went and tried to save the crew in the front part of the cabin, but it was completely on fire. They were clearly dead. So he pulled other passengers out of the burning tail section of the plane. 3 of them he pulled out were on fire, literally on fire. He had to put them out and pull them to safety. The last one actually died in his arms after he put the fire out on the human being. Of course, this deeply affected Gene, but he had no choice. He was the only crewman left, and he was in charge. And here he is out in the desert with basically 19 wounded people and many dead bodies laying around him, trying to keep them together, trying to keep them alive in the freezing cold of the Arabian desert at night. He gets them till morning, and then of course the heat becomes intense, and so he takes the life rafts and builds a shelter for the wounded. He finally sends 2 men in 2 groups, 4 men, to follow a telegraph line that he saw in the distance. And so he said, if you follow it, each going one way, you're going to find a community somewhere. He had no idea. It was only about 10 or 12 miles to the nearest community. The other issue he faced is by morning, a band of Arab tribespeople who couldn't speak English showed up, and clearly in Gene's mind and the others who were active felt that it was a clear danger, that they're starting to get closer, they were armed, they were holding their weapons in a threatening way. So Gene, not being able to speak to them, decided that, like a good captain in Star Trek, he would take command of these tribespeople. So he walked out to them. He had no weapons. And he just started speaking to them really loudly and in harsh commands and directing them what to do. And it apparently worked. They backed off. They looted the dead bodies and the other part of the plane, or any luggage or anything they could find, they looted. But they left the wounded with Gene alone. Though they sat there most of the afternoon to watch them, that evening help came and he was rescued. This incredible crash, he will have another near crash in New York City with Pan Am, and that will end his career in 1956. He'll decide 1948, he'll decide it's much safer to become a policeman in Los Angeles than to be a pilot with Pan Am. I want to get into the legacy of some of this as well now, because this can't go on too long. And if I've gone over anything too quickly for you, just ask questions. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Okay, you're not here, so you're not going to ask any questions. But if you do have questions, please send them into the Chautauqua Committee. I'm sure they can send them on to me by email, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. But the thing about this flight career, and even his time as police officer, which I'm not going to spend too much time with, as a police officer, he was very frustrated because he had no adventure. He was in traffic or doing PR because they found out he could write. He quickly became part of the PR attachment for the Los Angeles Police Department. He was a traffic cop most of the time, fired his weapon once on a Christmas day to shoot a dog who had been hit by a car in an intersection, and the dog was mangled and he put it out of its misery. But you can see this sense of wanting adventure, and the other part of it, this sense of what proper authority should be, a commander, a captain. And let me play with that first, and then maybe I'll talk about adventure at the end. He became, if you look at Star Trek, you see this experience that Gene had in his flight career. I'll go back to the crashes. One of the things with Pan Am, he finds out at the investigation about that crash in the desert, is that they had known that the number 2 engine had several problems with it, and yet they still okayed the flight to take off. And they also knew that 1 or 2 of the other engines had had some recent problems as well, that they overheated. Gene was furious when he found out that this wreck that killed 14 people and almost killed him was in large measure preventable by decent leadership. So he was furious about that. This brought up another time back in his Army career where a friend of his who was a commander of another wing was ordered from the Solomons to go on this mission. The commander at the time told the powers that be that, well, that's too far. We won't be able to do a bomb run and make it back safely. And they assured him that he was incorrect. Even though he had flown the planes every day, that he was incorrect, that the planes could make it back. Well, of course, the flight didn't make it back. The whole wing crashed, and most of them were killed. They crashed into the ocean, and most of them were killed, including Gene's friend. Gene was furious when he realized that it was the command mistake. So you can see sort of how this works in Star Trek. There is the Federation, but always the captains are out beyond the limits of the Federation's control. There are many scenes in Star Trek where they talk, well, we should report back to the starbase or whatever, and they talk about, well, it'll take 2 days for us to get information back because we're so far away. And so he has to make, Picard or Kirk have to make a decision now with the resources they have. And that to me was very much the lesson Gene had, that these men were on their own, they were out of touch, they were in a way in a desert of space, and they had to make decisions at this moment for them and their crew. So they're strong-willed, They're incredibly organized. They're loyal. They act with intellect, not emotion. They are brave beyond doubt. They are ready to do whatever needs to be done. There's a wisdom to them in a way. And also the way they value their crew. Even though it's a military hierarchy in Star Trek, you don't see much of that hierarchy. There's no saluting. There's no real command differences, just very slight insignia differences to denote rank. They treat each other more as he built off of the idea of Robert Heinlein, but also the idea from Shakespeare of a band of brothers. That everybody is trusted to do their best that they can and use their expertise. And so you see Kirk and Picard open to having junior officers disagree with them, to offer alternatives, and that they listen and they take in information and they alter to fit the needs of that particular moment using their people as they need to. So they're not martinets. They're not people who send people off to death in some silly, foolish mistake, or that they know better, or that they would cut corners like Pan Am and endanger people's lives. You don't see that at all. They are a monarch, but in a way, as one fellow said, they're a monarch of a socialist society where everyone works together for the good of the group. Ultimately, that wonderful line of the needs of the few or the many outweigh the needs of the one. Very much Gene Roddenberry's experience in the military of going back into burning planes, to pulling men out of these flaming wrecks while they're on fire, not even caring about his own safety. And you get this sense of Picard and Kirk as well. And when Roddenberry, after the Pan Am crash in the desert, he calls his parents the next day, once he's saved. He calls his parents, and it's a very slight conversation. They had no idea that it was as bad as he said. He said, well, we had crashed, and he had broken a few ribs, he said, and I have a brown stain in my underwear, and I really need a drink. And that's all he said. And if you go through a lot of the writings in Gene Roddenberry, he doesn't talk about it much, ever. Again, that sense of this bravery, this heroism. I'm trying to watch the time too, and I know I'm getting a little late, but I'm getting to the end. The other part of this, beyond the military, the sense of leadership of the captains, is the sense of adventure of the whole series, but especially the captains. They're soldiers, but they're scientists. They're always, as Picard always was saying, what is out there? What's next? Or, yes, the famous line, to seek out new civilizations, new creatures, new beings. One of my favorite series, one of the favorite shows, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's where the Horta with Captain Kirk are cutting tunnels and they're killing men, and they decide they'll kill this beast. But it's a new life form. They realize it's a life form, a different life form, unlike anything they've ever seen. And it's only defending its eggs, the modules, silicone modules. It's a silicone-based life form. And the whole premise of the show is that we need to understand this. They may be different. They may not look like us. They may not be us. They may have everything completely antithetical to what we believe. But we must value that. It's the great idea of this, to seek out these uncomfortable situations, these new civilizations, new people. Another great show episode was in Star Trek Next Generation. It was one of Gene's favorites, and it was called The Traveler. And the Traveler uses his mind and imagination to move the ship and everything else. He can move through time and space by his intellect. But the key question in the show is they ask him, what is your destination? And he says, there is no specific place I seek. But what is the purpose of your travel? Curiosity, he says. The perfect part of what Star Trek is supposed to be. You should understand that he hated episodes that use violence to resolve conflicts. He hated those episodes. He hated having Klingons. That's why in Star Trek Next Generation, he was so angry with the movies having Klingons as the bad guys, and that was the simple solution, to have Klingons the bad guys. And he hated that, and he hated the violence of it, so he made Worf part of the Star Trek crew. So the Klingons can't be bad if Worf is part of the crew. Intentionally to try to undermine future writers from coming up with this idea. It should be about, Star Trek should be about adventure, exploration. Or as he said, Roddenberry, a journey of endless possibilities. We are on a journey to keep an appointment with whatever we are. Great quote. A journey to keep an appointment with whatever we are. In a sense, this wonder, this adventure to new places, new worlds, would also help you find humanity, to find out the best part of humanity. And that is exactly what Gene Roddenberry was seeing in his Star Trek universe, this new society, this visionary, if you will, of a new way of life for humanity. That is another workshop. And for that, hopefully, we can be together again in either Tulsa, Enid, Lawton, Altus, or some other place than in your home and in my theater with our mask at the ready. I think that's it. If you have questions, please send them on. I'd love to answer them. I hope you found this somewhat entertaining. I hope you at least got some idea of what Chautauqua will be like this summer, hopefully when we can get back together. So get your hand sanitizer ready, go out and meet the world. I hope you're all healthy. I'm healthy and doing well, and in a way enjoying this COVID respite. I've gotten a lot of work done on my theater. Anyway, I'll see you all soon, I hope. Thank you so much, and have a good evening. It's me, the cameraman, so I'll just turn it off.